All right, we're going to address a couple other issues. The first issue we're going to address is timbre. So what I want you to do is I've got another video on this channel that's called timbre, basic timbre, and I want you to go watch that video to understand a little bit more about timbre. The next thing we're going to talk about is dynamics. Now, dynamics can be a huge thing, but when we're talking about music theory, most of the time we're talking about, notation denoting when somebody's supposed to be louder or softer. And basically, and sometimes it can actually be articulations that are articulated differently on different instruments that almost resemble the same concept of being louder and softer. And so that's the basic concept of it, but a lot of times it can also be like building dynamics of something building up, or dying down, some kind of construct that's built around that whole concept. And that's the basic concept's pretty simple though. And you basically, if you stick with that understanding, that kind of covers it. It can get complex, and the dynamics when you're talking about music theory can, they can start getting that whole stage. You can open that up and really, you dig around for a little bit and you'll see. But if you try to keep it that simple, that most of the time we're talking about notation, when something is getting louder or softer, or if something's building or fading out, or whatever it might be doing as far as decibel levels, and the dynamics of how that it's being put together so that, there is differences in decibel levels. It's almost the same kind of concept as dynamics when you're dealing with dynamics in a studio. It's the same kind of concept. So I try to keep that simple. Melody. Melody is one of these things that we could talk about for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. So let's not. Basically, if you get like on Wikipedia, melody is a series of tones sounding in succession that typically moves toward a climax of tension, then resolve to a state of rest. So basically what that's telling you is that, melody can be, some type of musical line that you've created that's, that's a complete sentence. Does that make sense? It's like you've completed this sentence, and it might be building up to something, or it might be, dying off, or it might be resolving, or it might need to be resolved. It might be leading towards something else. Melody is, in essence, is that. There are a lot of parts of melody, but basically it's building sentences and building paragraphs and of your musical structure, and trying to see it that way makes it a lot easier to get a hold of the concept. Some of the theoretical concepts around melody can get very in depth. So you can study melody all you want. It's basically that, it's a real simple concept that, and what you've seen, that what we read right here, and that's a pretty good generalization of it. The basic elements of a melody are pitch, duration, rhythm, and tempo. Those are parts of the actual melody that you're building, the sentence or the part of the song there, the paragraph, however you want to see it there. The tones of a melody are usually drawn from pitch systems such as scales. So the notes of the scales that you got, you're actually trying to build some type of little melody. Mary had a little lamb, that's a melody. And the melodies can be very complex and they can be very simple. It just kind of depends where you go with it. Or modes. Modes are something we haven't talked about, and we will in just a moment. So basically you understand that. I hope that it's pretty simple, and I'm trying to get you to see it in your mind that it is very simple. You're just creating a short sentence or a short paragraph that is, a part of the painting that's completed, that's going to be added to other parts of the painting. Does that make sense? And I'm trying to get through it with it being very simple without getting real complex into it, because it can be. You can study melody a lot, and I've watched videos of people studying Bach and Beethoven, and I just want to fall on my face, and I'm like, well, okay, that's enough. I understand that, but does that make sense? And some of it can be cool, and some of it can just get out of control. So, you know, if that's just the basic concept, you understand that pop goes the weasel, that's a melody, all right? And there might be lots of melodies that are interconnected to create structures in songs. So just try to keep that as simple as you can in that type of context. And you can study it more, but just the basic understanding like that should at least give you some basic foundations of, you know, so you understand kind of what melody is in your theory, that's where it's going. And, you know, so, and then the next thing, we were going to talk about modes a little bit. Now, on a guitar, modes can be very, 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 very pertinent, because the problem is you'll have a mode, you're playing, you know, like in G, and you're starting off on the G note on the guitar, and then you go up to A, and so you're playing the Dorian scale, and it's viewed as a Dorian mode. On the piano, it doesn't look like that. Basically, what the mode most of the time they're talking about in music theory is that you're basically, you're creating some melody or some type of improvisation around, let's say you're playing in the key of C. So you're basically, you've got the C chord going, and you're basically maybe roaming around on the scale notes around that while you play, but you keep resolving back to C. And so you'd be playing in, you know, C Ionian. The modes, I will specify the modes, you know, what modes are what, but it's, you know, the modes are pretty simple. And, you know, I don't want to get you too much into that right now, because the modes can basically be that you're writing a song and you're playing in the key of C, and you're actually forming the song based on the second interval. And so if you were basing that song on the second interval and really staying around, or in that section of the song, really around that second interval, that you would be playing like C Dorian. Does that make sense? Because it would be in the key of C, but you'd be really focused around the second interval, the chord at the second interval. Your melodies would be resolving back to that interval. And so you would basically be looking like you're playing in the mode of C Dorian. And I hope that's kind of simple to understand, and we'll address that a little bit better. So I hope you understand that in trying to keep melody really simple in your mind. When you're messing around with all the things we get talking about, that'll become way more apparent to what you're doing and what that means to you. And so at that, we addressed that timbre, melody, and dynamics, and we talked about modes. So let's talk a little bit more about modes. All right, so the modes. Okay, let's say we're talking about the key of C, all right? So, you know, on the piano, and when we're talking about modes, I kind of give a basic general description of that. And what happens there is you've got, it would be C in the key of C, because you've got the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh intervals. Each interval is going to be assigned a mode. So you'd come back, and the first interval would be Ionian, the second interval would be the root of Dorian, the third interval would be the root of Phrygian, the fourth interval would be the root of Lydian, the fifth interval would be the root of Mixolydian, the sixth interval would be the root of Aeolian, and the seventh interval would be the root of Locrian. Now, A is obviously your relative minor, so you can always understand if somebody's playing about the relative minor, so they're playing Aeolian around their relative minor, you can understand that basically they're playing around this A minor chord in the key of C, but they're basically, any melodies they're running are maybe running around all over the place, but they're always trying to resolve back to that A note. And so that would basically be viewed as playing, you know, A Aeolian, or C Aeolian, I should say. Because basically when you look at it, you have to look at the root and the key, the scale that you're working in. So E in that scale of C would be E Phrygian. Does that make sense? So if I was playing E minor and I was playing the melodies around it, but we're always resolving back to this E, but I was playing in C, that it would be E Phrygian, working off the third interval of the scale of C. And it's basically about that simple. It's not any, when I'm playing guitar, it gets a real complex, you know, and But on the piano, that basically, if you can understand that concept, to where if you're playing in the key of C, but you're really playing around D, you've got the D minor chord and you're really playing around that, and your melodies may be playing around all over the place, and any of the keys, any of the notes that you can play in that key, but they always keeps resolving back to that D. That's a pretty good example of you playing D Dorian in the key of C. Does that make sense? And, and if you were just playing in C and you were just the key of C, in the scale of C there, and you were just romping around in C major chord, and all your melodies were resolving, they kept resolving back to that C, that you were probably playing C Ionian. Does that make sense? So I hope that was a real simple concept. On the piano, it basically kind of works that way. The basic concept works that way. Sometimes with different instruments, the applications of it can be a little bit different, but the actual theory of what it was designed to be for a long time ago was that application. So that you can understand that, you're going to write this song and it's going to be in E Phrygian. That means that you're basing this song or this section, that it's based around the E minor chord that can be played in C, and the scale of the actual tonalities that, no matter what the melody you're playing, you keep resolving back towards at E as a resolve point of the song. And so basically that's been written in E Phrygian. Does that make sense? So I hope that kind of makes sense. I hope that, that wasn't too complex and the actual concept was very simple. Sometimes when I'm playing, it's like some of the way that the structure's playing, that you might be playing in E Phrygian and really playing around on that, and it start having a little Spanish flavor to it or something. It does, the way I learned on the guitar, that it really does. And it can have different flavors depending on what mode you're playing in. On the piano, sometimes it's not quite as pertinent, and I try to explain the actual mode and what that's going to mean to you and what that is like that, so it doesn't get too complicated. But you can still write, in F Lydian, that it's, what's F Lydian? Well, it's you're basically structuring around the F interval, the fourth interval in the key of C, around the F note, and it's basically that simple for the most part. So I hope that I addressed those issues fairly well. I certainly hope that you go back and watch that video on timbre. And if you want to read a little bit more about melody, I would suggest you hold on, because as you go through this and as you're playing around and you start trying to construct some things and you start trying to make little melodies and little lines up and little diddlies or whatever, that should start to become very obvious to you, that it's, it's something, it's a sentence that's part of the painting, or part of the paragraph, and, it's going to lead to something else, or it's going to resolve and then go somewhere else. So I hope that was very simple and easy to understand, and we're off to the next step.